Good morning. This is a special council meeting of the Municipality of the District of Lunenburg. It is December the 9th, and this morning we will just be attending to furthering our discussion on the municipal planning strategy, and our planning staff are with us today to to lead us in that discussion. And we will begin, I think, where we left off last week. I'm also reminded of what I forgot already this morning, that we should acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are privileged to share the land with them and should remind ourselves regularly about what that history means and how we should seek our reconciliation with the differences that we have that exist between us. We do have regrets from Councillor Brooks this morning, and Councillor DeLong is on a medical leave. So with those things that I've forgotten, we will recognize that we need an approval of the agenda for today, and I will entertain a motion. Councillor Oikel, seconded by Deputy Mayor Vino. All those in favor signify by raising their hands. Motion is carried. And we can then begin with this. I just wanted to get right to it, folks. We will then begin with our continuation of work on our staff, from our staff. And we do leave an opportunity for public input and during this process, and I spoke with the person sitting in the back today, welcome for their first council meeting. So thank you very much for attending this morning, but just wants to sit in on the meeting. So we will pass on the opportunity for public input, which we do provide at the beginning of all our meetings, and encourage people, if they have comments or concerns that they wish to bring before council, we allow and encourage people to do that at the beginning of each of our meetings. So with all that, now we will turn it over to staff.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to put my slides on the in the screen in one moment here. Great. So as the mayor mentioned, this is the continuation of the topics that we were being discussed last Tuesday as well. So this is kind of the third discussion council is having. There's one more scheduled for next Tuesday as well. In terms of an agenda this morning, I'll do a little bit of a recap of what was some of the directions that were provided last week. And then before jumping right back into those zoning things, I think based on some of the feedback we had last week, what we'll just start with, we'll just back out just for a couple of minutes at the beginning, just cover off some of what the zoning approach, the overall plan was with that. I'll kind of go through all of the zones that you would have seen in the first draft, just so that when we start to really dig into some of those individual pieces, you're aware of all the other things that are floating out there or maybe haven't been discussed yet. Just to provide a bit more context, I think that might help the discussion moving forward. So just in terms of some of the direction that was provided last week, so we started off with campgrounds and RV parks, and council indicated a desire to permit campgrounds and RV parks by development agreement in most zones. In terms of some of those pieces around water courses and wetlands, council provided direction around a 15-meter vegetative buffer, around inland water bodies, as well as a 20-meter development setback from both water courses as well as wetlands. And then there was a discussion that kind of continued to the end around zoning and lakeshore zones. And so we'll touch on that. Council did provide direction against a specific lakeshore zone, kind of within the option that was provided there. But we recognize there was some continued discussion about what might be a better fit for that. And so we're prepared today with some other information. I think we'll address some of those concerns and ideas that council brought up last time. So first, we'll just kind of start at a high level here, just in terms of where the direction comes from here. So the Municipal Government Act has a section that specifies all land within a municipality must be the subject of a municipal planning strategy. So that's where that new legislation passed in 2018, I believe, kind of originates from. This requirement for minimum planning, this is where this stems from. The strategy has to have, you know, at a high level, policies respecting the use, management, development of lands. Where it has a strategy, then it also has to have a land use bylaw. And the land use bylaw has to have zones which need to list permitted or prohibited uses, as well as a whole bunch of other kind of more formal pieces there that make it work correctly. But that's basically the structure that says you have to have planning, you have to have zoning, you have the strategy, you have to have the bylaw to implement it, and you have to have zones. In terms of what that looks like, that's, you know, a whole bunch of different, you could go in a whole bunch of different directions. But zoning itself generally regulates land use by dividing areas into different zones, and those zones dictate the types of different uses that are permitted in those areas. So we can picture things like residential, commercial, industrial, conservation. Each zone typically has unique uses and regulations that pertain to it. Why it's important and why the province passed the legislation when it did, and why other provinces across the country and internationally take this approach is because it allows communities to grow in a more predictable, planned, safe manner. It does help protect values by giving predictability, and also there's pieces there that can protect the environment, support businesses, and also help maintain things that people want to stay the same, so protecting the character. It also allows communities to direct development in the way that they want to see it play out, and then kind of put the policies in place that you can do the development that aligns with the goals of the community itself. So some of the principles that have guided the work that we've done to date is around, number one is flexibility, recognizing that we're starting from a place of most of the municipality is unzoned. So this is a big change for residents. And the idea being flexibility for whatever those new rules look like is going to be important. Another key piece there is that around existing uses, and even if there's a zone that doesn't allow whatever that existing use is, to recognize that that can continue without any types of restrictions in most zones. Another piece is around largely looking at communities rather than property by property. So given that how vast our municipality is, it would be next to impossible to really understand exactly what is happening on each property, understand what the owner wants to do with it, and then come up with a zone that might fit that. So this is not looking as much at the individual property level as more of the community level. There's also kind of some pieces around ensuring that things like housing are not being overly restrictive in the way that it might prohibit different types of housing, or being overly discriminatory. Sometimes municipalities have strayed into that area, particularly urban areas, trying to exclude different types of people or different types of housing. So it's being very much aware of that. And then also creating kind of tiers or categories of ways to regulate land use based on things like thresholds. So whether it's the number of units, whether it's the number of or the size of a development, in order to have different controls that are in place. So this is what you would have seen in that first draft. There are a lot of different zones shown there. Those zones are not kind of equally distributed. So the beige, the light kind of color in the background, that's that rural general zone. And we've talked a little bit about that in previous weeks, but that's really the basis of all of the zoning is kind of one base, and then you can kind of add over top, or you add other things that you want over top of that, but there's always going to be some general zone that fills in all of the background. So there's several zones listed there that are shown on the map. There's also several other zones that don't have any properties with that zone on them. And so in the in the draft bylaw, you would have seen a commercial recreation zone, a light industrial zone. There aren't any properties that have that zone. So the thinking was at that time that, you know, if there were certain types of uses that someone wanted to do, they would rezone to do that. Rosemary's going to speak on some of those zones kind of later when we get to that section. But in terms of the number of zones shown on the map, there are more in the document than there are on the map. So just in terms of some of the direction that's been provided so far, here's kind of a bit of a list of kind of where things are in terms of the direction the council has given and the ones that we've addressed so far. So we have that general rural zone. That's kind of a given. So even though we haven't really talked, you know, what does that zone look like? It's kind of the basis of all of this. So there's going to be a background, a general zone that's going to be the kind of most flexible in the areas that are the most rural, the most general development. This will be the lightest touch, basically. So we haven't talked about it a whole lot, but that's kind of a given. There was a good discussion about the rural agricultural potential zone. The asterisks that you're seeing here, those are ones where they're kind of meaning a provincial statement of interest, or they're kind of needing to address something there. Other zones that we'll talk about today include the mixed use service zone. That has an asterisk because it kind of pertains to the statement of interest on infrastructure, making the best use of our water and wastewater. Rural residential, hamlet zones. The Lakeshore residential zone has been crossed out based on the discussion from last week. Conservation zone, the protected watershed zones and overlay, that's speaking to the requirement to protect drinking water supplies. Then we have recreation and parks, and then those future use zones that don't actually have any properties mapped. So here's kind of I'm just going to quickly go through these. We'll come back to most of these in a more kind of formalized way, seeking direction and having more discussion about it. But these are just to highlight, what are these zones? What are we talking about when we're talking about that zone? What's the intention? Just so you have that kind of picture about, here's all of the zones. And then we can have those a little bit more discussion. So the general rural zone, as I mentioned, this is really kind of the most wide-ranging, the most prevalent. No matter what direction you take, I can say pretty confidently, this is kind of going to be the most flexible and most prevalent zone. So this is basically a wide range of land use activities, lower density residential development, a whole bunch of other different types of things. We've got natural resources, commercial, industrial, institutional, basically reflecting the rural parts of our municipality, continuing to do the similar types of things that those areas have always done. Middlewood is a community that kind of can represent where that general rural zone might represent. So that's just showing us the type of community that rural zone would fit. Next, we have the mixed use service zone. So as I mentioned, this pertains particularly to areas that have a lot of big investment in terms of infrastructure. So we have here in Osprey Village a water system as well as a wastewater system. A lot of money goes into that. We can support density in this area that we can't support in other parts. This zone is aimed at basically filling in the unzoned areas that have services and density to be similar to what the Osprey Village plan area already has. So the pink here is what we're seeing as the kind of potential mixed use service zone. Next, we have our rural residential zone. The idea with this is a zone that's specific to rural residential subdivisions that would limit things like bigger commercial and industrial activities because they wouldn't fit within kind of that more compact residential development. Lakeshore residential zone, we already kind of touched a bunch on that, but the idea with this was to limit uses around lake shores, similar to the rural residential zone, but also thinking about things like lot sizes in order to also think about protecting lake water quality. Hamlet Center as well as Hamlet residential zones, so those are geared towards the more kind of established settlements, villages, if that's a better term, and that's really thinking about village character of communities. So mixed uses, things like commercial, industrial, community, residential, and having two zones, one that's more of a mixed use, kind of a more of that main street, and then those kind of surrounding areas around it. Conservation zone, that's the idea with that is recognizing lands that are already protected by other levels of government or conservation organizations. It's not a really impactful zone because it's basically mimicking what other governments have already done. So if it's federally protected lands, we're not introducing new protections, we're just recognizing what's there. It helps clarify and understand what the intended uses for those parcels are. Because as you know, municipalities are the only jurisdiction that have the ability to have zoning. So we're really just making sure that everything's recognized for what it is. Here we have protected watershed zones, and we've talked a bit about this in previous workshops. This is kind of hitting on that statement of interest around drinking water supply specifically. So we've got the areas that have the bigger lakes providing water to the town of Bridgewater as well as this area. And then we have Oakland and Lake and Dares Lake. So town of Mahone Bay as well as town of Lunenburg. All of those town water supplies are lakes from within the district of Lunenburg. This is zoning to address the protection of the drinking water supplies for those areas. The overlay is another piece, and we've talked about that in the past as well. And that's really thinking about the kind of natural drinking water watershed. So all the areas within the overlay are areas that drain eventually into those lakes and a level of protection for those areas. Recreation and park zone. This is really about just recognizing parklands, open spaces, primarily just those parks and things like that that the municipality already owns, and recognizing what their intended uses are. Here are these zones that didn't have any maps to show, but a commercial recreation zone, kind of geared towards larger scale tourist accommodations, as well as things like shooting ranges or racetracks, bigger types of tourist or commercial types of activities that are geared towards tourism. General commercial zone, I think it's self-explanatory. Light industrial zone, so that's industrial uses that are, you could picture things like warehouses or workshops as opposed to heavy industrial. That's thinking, typically bigger or more impactful, pulp mills and oil refineries and that type of thing. Lastly, a fisheries and marine zone. That's more of a specific for coastal communities, things like fish plants, boat yards, ship repair, that type of use. So that was a lot, but the idea there was that covers everything. So we've talked about all of the zones that were in draft one, so that when we kind of get into, we're going to now circle back to each of those so that there could be a discussion and seeking direction from council on these and these other areas that we haven't gotten direction yet on. So I'm going to hand it over to Rosemary, and she's going to start.
Could we just Reed? Could we just stop there and just pause for a minute while, if there's particular questions related to that part of the presentation, then we can move on. Does anybody have any question? I'll start. I just had one question about the hamlet, and in thinking about potential communities within the district that could be in that classification, they are very much mixed. There isn't often a main street defined. There may be a main street, but it's got both residential and commercial activity on the same street. So could it in the end just be that we designate it as a hamlet and it continues to have that mixed nature of it? Can you just speak to that? I'm thinking particularly of New Germany's probably the area that is most closely aligned with that description.
Yes, exactly. And so actually that's going to be one of the options that we'll talk about as, you don't have to have two zones. You can have one zone that basically represents the whole community. And in either case, the idea is that either of those zones kind of represent a fairly mixed use land uses. It's trying to capture the variety of communities, as you've mentioned. Some are just a crossroads, some are along Main Street, or some are mixed. And New Germany is clearly kind of our most kind of built up settlement area in the municipality in terms of, if you were to picture what are those main areas, and we have a sewer system there. So obviously it's very different from other communities, and it's the largest for sure. So if you were looking at a different type of zoning that represents your villages or small communities in the municipality, that would be the one that comes, you know, as the top of the list in terms of that kind of built up character. And there's a lot of flexibility with what you can do with that. There's different reasons why you might want to. Some of the challenges with creating that zone, though, are trying to define where it stops and starts and where the edges are. A lot of that, I think, from the work that we've done is largely been at the desktop level. So the key piece, I think, in some of that is those communities should really define where they think that the borders are, if they should determine that at all. So it doesn't need to be, there's no cookie cutter approach to this. It's got to be what fits each community. Some communities it may not be appropriate at all. So we did do various iterations of that. We took a lot out. So the list has been pared down, but if it's not the right approach, it's not the right approach.
So just if I might further to that, and then we'll go to Councillor Smith. I don't know if Councillor Moore wants to speak or not. Not yet. I guess the other, because in draft one, there was also consideration for communities like Petite and La Have, I think were identified in that. I'm not sure whether Blockhouse was or not. No. But there, it's like you really, I feel like they're kind of outside the realm of the hamlet definition, even though they do have maybe a defined center. They just, it's like they peter off to other community, like to the rural general, in a way that makes it really hard to define where the beginning and end would be. Maybe La Have not quite as much, but both La Have and Petite, I think, fall into that category. So in my thinking, the only one that really fit was New Germany, and that was partly related to the infrastructure piece that defines it, and that if we're looking at an expansion at some point of that service, which if you're thinking about growth, that you should be thinking about that we would consider that as a village or hamlet defined by how the infrastructure could support it, or potential for growth for that infrastructure. So it is somewhat defined by what's there now, but also what potentially could be there as it grows. So,
and if I could just add,
yep.
I guess part of what you can do with that that village kind of zoning is to try to look at what you want it to become in the future. And a lot of these communities have incredible potential for new growth that's appropriate for their scale, but to create more walkable, kind of complete communities in these areas. That's really traditionally what they were. So it's more almost a reflection of what it was in the past. But over time, we've got provincial roads that run through these areas. You can start to define what it is you want that to look like in the future through this. I don't think that's really that's not really, I don't think, within the scope probably of this work, but in future years, you can look in more detail at what are those communities, what do you want them to look like? Do you want them to become more walkable and to provide more of those services? Is there a transit system that provides services to people? Are there facilities for people who live in the outer areas to come into those? So starting to think about those as kind of small areas of growth where you can concentrate the different services and things like that and improve kind of the quality of life in those areas.
Councillor Smith.
Just a general question, I guess, about thinking through what zoning does. And I think throughout this process, we realize we're doing a lot at one time, and that some things we're going to have to come back to because we just can't. We can't implement everything all at once, nor should we want to, because we want to have good public input which will improve policymaking. So we're going for a lighter touch in some of our work, maybe than we could be doing. But I'm trying to think about zones as putting some pieces in place that we might come back to. So probably no one wants to reopen the Lakeshore residential conversation, but I didn't get a chance to vote on that. And I think I would have voted for the third option, which was to establish a zone and maybe not create a bunch of regulations for that zone, but recognize it's a different ecosystem, a different kind of residential that we could come back to later, when we had more time to take on that project more fully. But I would just like to hear your thoughts, about, should we be thinking about that, or is it just as easy to create a new zone later? Do we have to have our full kind of complement of zones right now, or could we create a whole completely different zone if we needed to in the future? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess I don't know if I have a great answer for you to that question. Anything's possible, but I guess I think in terms of where we've come from with this work and how far we have to go, I think given at this state in the process and how long it's taken to get here, I think the best approach is kind of moving forward with building upon what's here and taking the things that council would like out of what's already been kind of presented, and then we can make some changes. It's certainly easy to take things out. To put new things in place, it creates a lot more work. So there is a lot here. This is a comprehensive plan. This will be comprehensive planning. And in some respects, council has already indicated that they didn't want to just do a minimum on some things, and they'd like to do a little bit more in some areas and not in others. It is possible to do new zones in the future. And these plans do need to be reviewed and then comprehensively reviewed every 10 years is the requirement. So it's not a frequent exercise where we would be getting into that level of analysis. But yeah, having said that, I think just in order, if council's, really wanting to say, let's accomplish, let's get this done. We want to get it done in 2026, and we have a timeline and a plan. In order to stick to that, there aren't a lot of new things I think that we can do within that time frame, at least. It is up to council in terms of the time frame and the amount of work. But what we'll try to do is communicate when something would affect that timeline or create additional work that maybe there needs to be additional public input and things like that. And we'll try to advise whenever something like that comes up.
Okay, Councillor Oikel, and then we're gonna move on to hear the rest of the presentation. Yep.
I do like the idea of hamlets as one area rather than two separate, because for a variety of reasons. One is that a lot of the places consider themselves like a little village, like Petite, and but yet the province doesn't recognize aren't creating any more villages. Also, it's a really good tourist thing to say, come to Petite, the hamlet of the South Shore, or whatever, right? When you think of it that way. But I do like, if it's going to help protect it as a village, even though we can't use that term, I think that it's a good zone to continue to discuss and have.
Okay, let's move on. Rosemary.
Awesome. So Reed spoke to this a little bit earlier, but Osprey Village is the main serviced area in the municipality with the capacity for growth. However, the Osprey Village secondary planning area, the gray area on the map on the screen, doesn't cover the whole service area. And as a result, we need to think carefully about how growth should be managed in the parts of Osprey Village that fall outside of the current secondary plan. There's also a relevant statement of provincial interest regarding infrastructure, the goal of which is to make efficient use of municipal water supply and municipal wastewater disposal systems. And the province provides a number of suggested measures to address this statement, including maximizing the use of existing infrastructure by enabling infill development and higher density development, and by discouraging development from leapfrogging over areas serviced by municipal infrastructure to unserviced areas. And so, as I mentioned, the Osprey Village secondary planning area does not cover all of the serviced areas in Cookville. However, it does promote medium to high density residential uses, commercial and light industrial uses, and any uses permitted within the general commercial zone of the secondary planning area are required to be reviewed through site plan approval. And so through public feedback over the summer, we heard that there was an interest in more strategic planning around infrastructure, housing, and growth, and some desire for service hubs. So all of this leads us to consider options for managing growth in the unplanned parts of Osprey Village. And what we're talking about here is the red area on the map that you see. And so we have three options to consider. The first is applying a general rural zone or the general rural zone to the unplanned parts of Osprey Village, which would enable almost any type of development in the area. This is not recommended because it is inconsistent with the provincial statement of interest and would also be inconsistent with the Osprey Village secondary planning area. The second option is to establish a mixed-use service zone to encourage density near serviced areas of the municipality in Cookville, permitting new large format commercial development as of right. So unlike the Osprey Village secondary planning area, which requires large-scale commercial development through site plan approval, second option would enable it as of right, so only requiring a development permit. And option 3 is the recommended option because it's the most consistent with the Osprey Village secondary planning area. We would recommend establishing a mixed-use service zone to encourage density in the serviced areas of the municipality in Cookville, requiring new large format commercial development to meet comprehensive site plan requirements. Site plan approval would review requirements such as layout and design, circulation, landscaping, and stormwater management of large format commercial development. So those are the three options.
So on this, you're, as we did in our other sessions, asking for some feedback on which would be the most acceptable option here?
Correct.
Okay. Questions, comments? Not seen. Oh, Councillor Royko.
Thank you. I'm leaning in agreement with you, but I'm concerned about how big of an area it is, because I don't know where the cutoff is, because I know that, okay, just behind Walmart, okay. Because I was concerned about that gray area that's behind Walmart for possible housing.
So the area we're discussing in terms of the
Just-
mixed-use service zone would be the red area,
Yeah.
which would complement the existing plan area, which is the gray.
Just for clarification, so the gray area is currently what option 3 describes?
Exactly.
Okay, and so you're recommending that the red be zoned similar to that?
Correct, for consistency.
And then option 1, although it says minimum planning, your opinion is that it would actually end up being determined to be inconsistent with the provincial statement of interest because you want to get higher density things happening where you've already invested in infrastructure.
Correct.
So really you're looking at between options 2 and options 3.
Correct.
Okay.
Is it clear to everyone with that? Councillor Hubley, it's clear? Okay, okay. Yeah,
I can make maybe a clarification or just a comment, because we've talked about the Osprey Village plan area, which you're familiar with, and then we're talking about the unzoned area that would accompany this. I think down the road, the Osprey Village plan area as a secondary plan should be probably combined. That would make a lot more sense. And at that time, you know, it would be a lot easier if you have fairly similar rules in both areas to create a secondary plan area, which, you know, covers the whole kind of serviced area and says this is where our growth area is and this is where we want to see density. Because right now we've kind of got half and half. We're trying to fill in the other half, but someday, I think in our minds it makes sense that we still would maybe have a secondary plan in this area, unlike some of the other secondary plans, which would kind of really kind of merge eventually with the larger plan. Because this is a high growth area with the ability for a lot of different types of development, it's the kind of area that may make sense going forward and into the future to have a secondary plan, because you want to have a lot more direction on what happens here, and having one bigger area with consistent rules in place would make a lot of sense.
Councillor Burns.
What I was going to say to council is, you know, I normally would choose option 1, but option 2 and 3 are not inconsistent with what is already happening there. That's really what this comes down to for me, is that you're in that red area on the map. You're not going to see a large amount of single family homes being built. I don't think any of us would buy a lot and do that there right now. So I don't think that I don't think in a choice here that is on its face more restrictive is practically more restrictive to what people are going to do with the land in that area. We're not truly taking anything away from people with what they would already likely do with the land in that area.
Could we have a show of hands of those supporting option 1, option 2, option 3? Okay, so we're pretty consistent on that. So let's move on.
So this is just an overview of what we have discussed in the last session, so last week. And as Reid mentioned earlier, I'm just going to give a high level of the lakeshore zone, as council already voted on this, but there were additional conversations due to some confusion after the voting was done. And mostly the confusion was about what land use will be permitted or not permitted if the zone, if council will go with the zone or not. So just a bit of an overview. The lakeshore zone purpose was to be applied to 69 lakes. These lakes were identified to be of high development pressure right now or in the future due to their location next to major transportation routes. The zone was designed to have greater development setbacks or larger lots to maintain that low density type of residential community fabric that is currently located around lakes, so the cottage-like type of development. And in addition to that, there was also regulations around making sure what type of uses will be around those lakes. So making sure that also protecting the lake, the water quality, but also protecting that type of community like that we are seeing in this municipality for hundreds of years. And the land uses were supposed to regulate, make sure that there will be low-density residential uses, institutional uses, some low-impact recreational uses like trails, but also allowing for some tourist accommodation in terms of a very small unit, like around 3 or 3 tourist accommodation units and things like that. We did listen to, and of course there will be the as of right after council decided that as of right uses such as backyard agricultural uses that are already permitted as of right, as council already directed staff about that. We listened to those comments and those confusions that were made after the voting was done, and we realized that we don't want to open that subject and talk about that zone. However, so we did find some type of way to protect residential uses or to apply residential uses on lakes, but not on all the lakes, so it won't encompass all the lakes, but Anna will be discussing that option right now. So I'll move it to Anna.
All right, so moving on to rural subdivisions, so rural residential subdivisions in the municipality, which this could potentially be an option for covering off those lakeside communities, as we just discussed. But I'll kind of do an overview of this zone, but just have in the back of your mind that this could also apply to some like cottage-style residential communities that surround lakes. So the municipality has several compact, primarily residential neighborhoods that consist of a higher density development pattern compared to the surrounding rural areas. So examples of this type of development are the subdivisions in Pine Grove, Conqueror Bank, and Lower Branch. There are many also lakeside communities that fit these characteristics, and they typically have single unit homes and are also often the result of an intentional subdivision development. And home-based businesses are common in these neighborhoods, which can result in land use conflicts if the operation is not compatible within a denser residential context. So as council indicated at the first discussion, home-based businesses should be regulated to some extent in some residential areas. So it's in these denser residential communities where home-based business regulations could apply. Unlike the rural general zone where commercial uses would be permitted whether they operate as a home-based business or as a primary commercial use, these areas could limit commercial activity to only home-based businesses and could be subject to certain regulations such as limiting floor area. And then another important consideration to make is around groundwater. So since most residential developments are serviced by on-site wells, increased development in rural areas can put pressure on groundwater supplies, which can ultimately have a negative impact on existing residents that surround a new development. So to help address this, a rezoning process for newly proposed residential subdivisions would help to provide additional oversight. So through this process, council could request water studies to confirm groundwater supplies and to ensure that new developments of a certain size would not negatively impact residents. So to be consistent with the existing cluster development regulations, new residential developments with 6 or more lots could trigger this rezoning process. And under the draft 1 approach, the rural residential zone was applied to residential developments with 6 or more lots that included an internal road or shared driveway. And it also applied to future developments that create 6 or more lots at one time through subdivision or within a 5-year time period. And then just to note, looking at other municipalities, so the municipality of Chester has a single unit residential zone for established residential neighborhoods that kind of fit the similar criteria, and this is to ensure quiet residential character. The zone is only applied to existing neighborhoods and is more restrictive in terms of land uses, so it regulates things like recreational vehicles, the keeping of farm animals, and it permits only limited types of home-based businesses. And then looking at Queens Municipality, they don't really have a similar approach to this, so I just kind of highlighted Chester's approach there. And then moving on to the options. So here's 2 options for council to consider. Option 1 is to have no additional controls for rural subdivisions and to treat them the same as the rural areas. So this would mean applying the rural general zone to rural residential subdivisions. And it would provide no ability to limit certain types of land uses or regulate home-based businesses in these areas. And there would be no requirement for public process or the ability to request water studies to confirm groundwater supplies.
Go ahead, Councillor Moore.
So is this, I'm so confused. There's so many slides and I get so confused in them all. Is this just on lakes? No, this is on, like, say, a river? And does this pertain to something that's already in process?
Good question.
Yeah, already in process. Like, we do have, I'm not going to name names, but we do have one to the north of us that's a subdivision. Will this, whatever option we choose and goes forward and is passed, when we pass this 2 years' time, no, sorry. Sorry, Jeff. Will these developers have to comply with this, even though they've already started? There's no actual, there's just roads and lots. Like, I'm wondering how I'm going to answer to this.
With respect to new stuff that's underway, this would apply to lots that are created. So we're looking at those lots that exist now. So if those are already, if they're not yet created and the subdivision doesn't yet exist, it wouldn't apply. So it's all looking to apply this zone to the lots that exist, that have been registered with the Registry of Deeds and everything, and we have a clear, it's all of that paperwork is done. That's how we're defining whether to apply that zone to a certain subdivision.
So, okay, so say Indian Lake, and that's the one in your area, right? Okay, so there's a residential zone there, like there's houses and all that kind of stuff there. So the people that are there, aren't they grandfathered in?
Yeah, people are always going to be grandfathered in from whatever they're doing going forward. So if there's something there that maybe doesn't work within a residential zone, that's no problem for those people. This is only going forward from the time that it passes. So if they've got a certain business on a property and it happens to be in a residential zone in the future, and that business is bigger than, let's say, the home-based business regulations, that's not an issue because that was already there to begin with.
And can I just, one more quick snapper? So referring back to a subdivision that's being developed already in the municipality, and the roads are being done. So what we decide here will determine whether or not any of those homeowners that are going to buy, any people that's going to buy land there and build a home or whatever, or buy a home there that's already built, will be told if they want to open up a small business. I go back to that, a small business in their house or in part of their outbuilding or something, that there's going to be lots of regulations about how big it can be and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so based on that earlier direction that council kind of provided with home-based businesses, then potentially yes. Although the direction that was given around home-based businesses was that it be scaled way back from what was in the first draft, just to speak to the size and maybe a list of uses that would be prohibited.
Yeah. Okay.
So it would be based on the square footage? Those would be the limitations and the actual function of the business?
That's correct.
Right. Councillor Smith.
I'll be supporting option 2. I think it makes sense. I think in our notes it said that it aligned with some of the things around cluster developments too. So that I think it's really important that we're able to request a water study. If that seems like if that seems like something we would want in that area, the size of the new subdivision, I think that's really important considering the drought that we just went through. And I'm satisfied that we've given direction that the regulations on home-based businesses are going to be really, really light, and they're not really comparable to some of the regulations, say in Chester. Like, we're not going to be telling people they can't have backyard animals, and our regulations on home-based businesses are going to be much less restrictive. So I'm happy supporting that, and although I said I would have preferred to have voted on a lakeshore residential zone as well, to distinguish between the character and the areas, I'm happy to find common ground and combine them into one.
Councillor Hubley?
Thank you. I have two things that I got rolling around in here. A vote for option 2 includes lakes, correct?
Yeah, it would
is-
fit, if it fit the criteria of the zone, it would
Okay,
fit
'cause it's
areas
stated.
around lakes.
It is stated here.
Yeah.
So I know in District 4, we have situations where we have a business on a lot and the lot next door is for sale. Does that mean the person after these regulations that's buying this lot next door is not going to be able to do what their neighbors are allowed to do when it comes to home-based businesses? That's a possibility, isn't it? It does mean that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yes,
that's a
yes.
hypothetical situation.
So
Yep,
this
that's-
could happen, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
If I-
Other questions, Anna?
I just wanted to just clarify that this zone isn't just about lakeside communities, it's also inland residential subdivisions. So it could apply to lake areas, but also inland subdivisions, just to make that clear.
I think I seen heads nodding. I think council understands that. And I guess my question would be how this would be applied then. How you make the determination.
Yeah, so under draft 1, we had this zone, and our criteria was if there was an existing subdivision with 6 or more lots and had an internal road, so a private road or a shared driveway, because sometimes there's flag lots that also serve as an internal road. So that was kind of our basis for criteria, and I mean, that's flexible. If council decides that that criteria isn't the direction that they want to go, that's perfectly fine. But it would be a matter of figuring out what seems to fit, what council would want to constitute a subdivision as. We chose the number 6 because that's consistent with the cluster development regulations, but by all means, there's flexibility there. And so it would just be doing sort of similar to what we did previously, where we do a mapping exercise and apply the zone to subdivisions that fit that criteria, basically.
Just to illustrate what Anna's talking about, so what they put together here is an example. I think this is Indian Lake area. Yeah, that's a subdivision that would fit into this kind of rural residential type of situation. So under the draft number 1, a bunch of these lots previously were shown as lakeshore residential, and then some of the other ones that didn't have water frontage were shown as rural residential. The thinking here is that they can all just be rural residential in this option. Another piece that would be different is the large block that's up above, as well as the large block that's down below this. Those would remain as rural because those lots have not been subdivided yet. The rural residential zone, or sorry, the lakefront residential zone, as we talked about it previously, would have extended a band all the way around the lake, even if it wasn't yet developed or subdivided. So this would pull back a bit from that zoning all the way around the lake and just focus on those lots that have been subdivided. In terms of how new development is guided, having that requirement to rezone if you're doing 6 or more, that then requires, if somebody wants to develop these larger parcels, that's fine, but they would need to go through that process, make sure there's adequate water supply, and look at a public process as well to make sure that it fits the needs of that community.
Deputy Mayor Vino, and then Councillor Bell, and then we're going to, I think, if it's clear, we'll take a bit of a straw vote on this to see where we're all sitting. Deputy Mayor Vino.
My question is kind of a follow-up to what Councillor Hubley had said about a new lot being developed once whatever exemptions we put in place. Do they have the option to appeal it, to apply to the municipality, to, I don't know what the exact word is, but basically to come to before the municipality, the planning department, to say, our current regulations prohibit business A. can we come to the municipality and ask for an exemption? Would that exist under these designations?
Yeah, that's probably a perfect example of a zoning amendment application. Yeah. Now, I think the idea would be that, I mean, we'll come up with a set of home-based business regulations and part of draft 2 that will try to hit kind of what council has indicated that you want. And if that's not quite there, we can change that. But what we'll try to do is develop something that you are okay with and what you want to see in terms of, the size of these operations in residential areas. So I guess the question will be, in that situation, if you do come to an agreement on, okay, this is the size that we're comfortable with in a residential area, and someone comes along the next day and says, oh, I want to do something that's bigger than that, then the question becomes, do we have it too small, or do we want to give someone an exemption? Is that okay? Like, that's kind of the idea. You want to set the regulations in place that make work for you and what you think works for those areas. And then if someone comes along and asks, could I have something different? Then I guess the question for them will go back to you and say, you just put these rules in place. Does that still make sense? Or maybe the rule itself maybe was a little small or something. So yeah, you'd have to consider those at the time of an amendment.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you. I'm favoring option 2 because really for the first time we're looking at or viewing water as a resource. And it may be in limited quantities. I do believe that I have a subdivision in District 2, had this rule been in, would eliminate a lot of problems we got because new lots were created between long-lasting lots along the front for a subdivision. And so the subdivision was created on a higher level of land. Those new houses are watering their grass and flowers, washing their cars in the summer, while the original houses at the bottom of the hill have dry wells. And this was created, I think, because of the additional wells that were just plopped everywhere without regard for any type of study, because we didn't think it was important. But now, as our climate changes slightly, we see that water is a resource that we need to protect and make sure everyone has an adequate amount. Thank you.
Okay, could we just take a straw vote on this as presented on rural subdivisions? So option 1, those favoring option 1. We have 2. Those favoring option 2. And that would be 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, okay. We'll move on.
All right, so moving on to hamlets and villages. So there's many distinct communities throughout the municipality, which we can call villages, hamlets. It doesn't really matter what we call them at this point, but they are there and they're established communities that have been there for a long time. They serve as important service and social hubs and provide everyday amenities for residents. These villages play an important role in shaping MODL's unique cultural history, as many have historical significance and heritage value. It's common for these communities to have a center area, maybe not necessarily a main street, but a center that has a mix of land uses, including local businesses, community uses, emergency services, and industrial uses sometimes, as well as residential. The center areas are often surrounded by less mixed residential neighborhoods that are distinctly separate from the center. These villages are also key locations for future growth and potential service expansions. So examples that we brought up earlier as well are New Germany, Petite Riviere, and La Have. So the MGA states that the Municipal Government Act states that a municipal planning strategy must contain statements of policy regarding residential uses, commercial and industrial uses, institutional uses, recreational facilities, and public open spaces, as well as resource uses. While it's not indicated how these land uses should be addressed, since these built-up areas typically contain a mix of these land uses, planning considerations may need to be made to account for these areas to some extent to meet the statements of provincial interest in minimum planning. So to just look at neighboring municipalities quickly, so the region of Queens has a hamlet residential and a hamlet core zone, so 2 zones that apply to small communities like Port Medway, Mill Village, and Port Mouton. And then for the municipality of Chester, they also have a hamlet zone that applies to the areas along the Western Shore, Chester Basin, and parts of Hubbards. Okay, so getting into the options here for council to consider. So option 1 is to have no additional controls for defined villages and to treat them the same as rural areas. So this would be basically minimum planning. This option would mean that the rural general zone or whatever zone gets applied to the default rural areas would also be applied to these communities. And this approach would provide no ability to regulate land uses within these built-up communities. Option 2 is to have additional controls that apply to defined villages but do not distinguish between the center and the residential areas. So this option would involve establishing one zone or a single zone to be applied to defined villages to help separate them from rural areas. While it would allow for tailored regulations to some extent, there would be no ability to distinguish between center and residential areas and the village and also home-based businesses. There would be some limitations on regulating home-based businesses in that regard. This option could also involve limiting the number of communities designated as a village compared to draft number 1. So this would help to ensure that some communities are subject to land use controls while other villages are just zoned the same as the general areas. And then option 3 is to establish distinct controls for village center and the surrounding residential areas. This option would involve having 2 separate zones. One zone that applies to the center and another zone that applies to the residential area. With this approach, each zone would have a unique set of provisions to allow for tailored regulations. This option would help to address land use conflicts by having the ability to limit certain types of uses that are not compatible within residential areas, and to help direct certain land uses to the center areas and keeping them away from the residential areas. This option would also support the zoning framework for the regulation of home-based businesses in residential areas as indicated at the first council discussion. So staff recommend option number 2, which is a simplified approach to creating a single village zone that applies to some of the defined communities, as it would help to differentiate villages from the rural areas by applying land use regulations that are tailored towards the continuation of established and growing communities. It is also recommended to limit the number of villages that would be zoned to only include those that are the most recognizable or the ones that council feels that should get this designation. So I'm happy to answer any questions from there.
Councillor Moore.
Thank you. Village/hamlet. If it's just a community now, like I'm saying New Germany, it's just a community now with a number 10 going through it. Like there's no main street, there's no nothing. Does this mean that, let's say number 2 was to be put in place, or Lord help us, number 3. What would New Germany then be a village? Would it be village status? Would we have to have a commission like formed like Hebville? Like I'm very confused.
I don't believe you would need a commission. It's just the zoning designation. So it would just be designated as a village, but you don't need an accompanying designation to go along with that or a group.
These regulations cover the development as opposed to the governance. And so it wouldn't be any different than, if, for example, Osprey Village, how we have the plan here. It doesn't require that, for example, this area would be needed a structure, a governance structure. It is more about how you manage the development of the land and the properties that are there and what restrictions you may or may not put in place to build on.
Okay,
Okay?
thank you.
Councillor Reinhardt, and then Councillor Oikle.
This is a complicated one. I'm sort of between 1 and 2. There were some restrictions in draft 1 about livestock. Would those be gone, or would those still apply if we went with the hamlet village?
So based on council's previous discussion on livestock, it was directed that we will not be regulating livestock to any extent, so it wouldn't apply to these areas.
Okay, because I do see, I have heard from residents who do want some more structure for some of these areas. So I'm just kind of trying to determine if this is the right level. And I do see issues, as the mayor mentioned, like with finding the borders in some of these places that are pretty rural. Yeah, so maybe you could explain just a bit more about what the difference would be between, say, having the rural general versus the village in a place like Petite.
I think the like a big thing is directing commercial uses and certain types of uses that would be permitted in the rural general zone. For example, some industrial uses where the rural general zone is going to be pretty open and flexible. And then by having a zone that is, say, applied to Petite Riviere, that is, say, the village or the hamlet, whatever, it gives it some limitations. So if you don't want a certain type of industrial use right within that village, then it wouldn't be a permitted use. So it's about guiding development in a certain way to those areas or limiting development to sort of fit the characteristics and protect the historic character that is there. And there's also things about, protecting the heritage value.
Councillor Oikle?
Yeah, I just want to address Councillor Moore and restate that the province has said that no more villages can be created that would have a government type of commission.
I have a question, if anybody else is, while we're waiting, if anyone else has other questions, but in both, again, back to what I said earlier, that the only one that I really saw fit this was New Germany in terms of defining a village. We also are considering Petite and La Have, but in both those cases, it's hard for me to recognize where there would be land that is particularly in La Have, where it could be developed. It's given the geography and the topography of that community, which is a little different than Petite, it would extend back from the river, and that's, the topography doesn't really lend itself to development. So I've kind of taken that one out of the mix for just the way that village is located. In Petite, in looking at it, one would have to wonder where that development might happen, because as we have in most of these rural communities, there's strip development along the road structure or the historic travel patterns that existed, and now there's permanent roads in place. And in Petite, again, it would be, it's hard for me to visualize just where that development could actually happen. If you use the store and the fire hall, and then there's the river, so you have development potentially along the river, but then on the other side of the road there are lots, but they would be in behind what's already developed. So just from a practical point of view, I kind of take them out of the out of the mix, and really I keep falling back to New Germany. But I do think there is value in option 2 that does define it. But the only other place that I see we may want to give consideration to, because of the level of development that's happening, is around Blockhouse. And that has the secondary planning strategy in place, and we don't want to mess with that, but there already are some, but that is quite a little hot spot in our community in terms of what's happening there, and the number of new businesses that are wanting to locate in that area, and we also have some development there. But because it has a secondary planning strategy, I think that's why it's not been surfacing. But those would be my comments on those other 2. And so I guess I lean to not having them included, and that we only really focus on a village as New Germany. Other comments? Okay, Councillor Smith, and then we're gonna vote, and then we'll take a break. But we'll vote on sort of the options that are presented here. Councillor Smith.
I just want to confirm my understanding. So if we didn't, if we went for option 1, say, and there wasn't a hamlet, there'd also be no rural residential applied to the area as well, unless there was a subdivision. Because no matter what the density of housing in that area, if it's not on a private road, it wouldn't fall into that residential zone that we just talked about. So it would just be rural general.
Yeah, and unless there was a residential area within maybe the village area that fits the criteria of the rural residential zone. So it would need to have, like you say, an internal road, and it would have to have at least 6 lots, that kind of thing. But it could apply to areas of villages. But if there was no hamlet or village zone, then it would just be rural general.
That triggered a bunch of questions. Councillor Oikel and then Councillor Moore.
Just regarding the hamlet, and no disrespect, Mayor, but I do feel that having just limiting, saying that because they have central wastewater or central water, which we don't have in New Jersey, but we have central wastewater, that hamlets need to have that as justification to become a hamlet. Whereas I know that Councillor Reinhardt, it is her area, Petite is, but as a municipal councillor within the municipality and being in Petite a lot throughout the year, doing different things there, I really do feel that it should be considered as a hamlet because it is a unique community. It expands out. There is a restaurants in that area. There are a lot of variety of different stores. There is a veterinarian clinic. And so I don't think that we should limit hamlets to just areas that have specifically wastewater or water in their area. That I think we're limiting growth and potential to our smaller communities.
Just to clarify my point, I did not intend that it was just totally specifically defined by having infrastructure in place. There's more to it than defining that. That's one element of New Germany, but I didn't mean to preclude the others. There were other reasons for not including them. Anyway, Councillor, or to Reid.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I just wanted to point out that the hamlet or village zone can do several things at once. So one of those things is to show where you want to focus growth in the future, but it can also serve to protect and enhance what's there. So I think it's a very good point that there are some of those communities where we see growth and potential for growth, and some areas that they're just, I mean, a lot of it's geography. You can't accommodate a whole lot of additional growth. But in some of those areas, you may want to, that zone can be useful to define an area where, thinking more of the future, you want to enhance what that community looks like and have it become more of a walkable kind of destination and things like that. Not that all of that has to be accomplished through increased development, but perhaps it's more about focusing on the heritage aspects of it or the walkability or things like that. And by defining what that is and where it is, it allows you going forward to then focus some of those other aspects. Like if there was a focus on heritage or there was a focus on active transportation, things like that, having that defined area, it makes it a lot easier to kind of enhance what's there now.
Councillor Moore, did you have another comment?
So if option 2 was to go forward, and somebody in New Germany wanted to, and I'm going back to these home-based businesses because I'm very confused over where they can go and where they can't go. And somebody wanted to retire or start a business and wanted to turn their garage on their property into a auto body shop. Under option 2, if they're in that village area, would they be allowed?
So I guess option 2 is the creation of a zone that we don't yet have. But the idea would be that that zone would be more flexible than, say, a rural residential zone, because we've got a lot of mixed uses in our villages. So into that circumstance, like we haven't developed what criteria of what that zone would be, but I would think that's more likely okay in that situation versus, the rural residential subdivisions that we just talked about.
Okay, so my head tells me to go with option 2 because of potential growth in the future, but right now, until this gets passed and gone out to the public again, I'm going to have to go with option 1, and that's because of the uncertainty and misinformation and stuff that was put forward by the public in the first initial meeting in New Germany. So my head tells me to, but I'm going with my gut. I'm going with option 1, and then once it goes back out, I'll be able to know more how the people in the area feel once they know that we're not coming down with a true iron hammer. Thank you.
There was someone else, Councillor Bell and then Reinhardt.
Thank you. I think with option 2 being assigned to a rural area, which is more densely populated with residences and businesses, if option 2 was there and available for use, it might enhance the ability to get rural housing units or developments into areas like New Germany. But my second question is, can we create the description for village hamlets without assigning it to a geographical area so that we could go to residents in Blockhouse, New Germany, La Haven, Petite, through a plebiscite and ask them, which of the 2 options do you want? We have them both defined, but we haven't assigned them to a geographical area yet. Now is your chance to look at what you want your community to be and give them the chance to choose what would be the regular rural setting, closer to option 1, or the option 2, which would define what a village hamlet is. That's given the power of the community to decide what they want, knowing the descriptions that have been pre-prepared. That's my question.
I think what we might suggest, I think similar to what you're suggesting, is we would develop that zone, so whether it's a village zone that kind of takes these 2 and combines them. But what we would suggest is we would show it on a map, but then specifically ask people, does this make sense to you? Do you want it there at all? Or if you do want it there, is it in the right place? And that gives people something to see and work with and say, okay, well, what do you, we can come up with where we think the line might be, but they probably know better than us about where it should be. But sometimes, from our experience doing that engagement, having something to work with, you know, gives people kind of an ability to say, okay, well, maybe, let me play around with this. And if they really don't want it at all, they can also say that. But sometimes it's nice to have that already shown as a working document.
Councillor Reinhardt.
I had a very similar comment. Yeah, it seems hard to make a decision on whether this place should be in this category or this category when we don't know what the definition of the category is. So I'd be interested in seeing what the actual zone looks like. And yeah, going out into the community and seeing if that is, you know, it's going to look, it sounds very different from what was in draft one. So seeing if the new concept is something that works with the community, and if not, it can go.
I think in order to those comments, I think in order to accommodate the timeline that we're on, we need to define it as I think you're saying, Councillor Reinhardt, is actually assign it to a map and then get feedback from the community when we go back. And I think it's to Councillor Moore's point as well, to see what the definition, what it really encompasses, and then what does that mean for having that village zone attached to it. And then having a really good conversation in those locations about what that means. And I think that is part of the public engagement piece that will come when we finish, when we have draft 2 ready. So, absolutely.
So let's say number 2 goes forward, but we already said we're not doing anything with livestock, correct? So livestock would not be in this situation. Okay, perfect, thank you.
I'm going to take a straw poll. So those in supporting option 1. 3. Okay, those supporting option 2. So we have 2, 4, 6, 6. Okay, does that give you enough to go forward? Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We will resume our meeting, and if everyone could return to their seats. And I was just checking with our planning staff to see where we're at in the progression through the document, and I think we are ready now to move to watershed areas, and so we'll continue.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll just repeat that slide because we did discuss this last week, but it's been a week since then. So we are fortunate to have a lot of ecological important areas like lakes, river, wetlands, forests, and of course coastlines. Our landscape is very unique and it changes from one area to another, and it's important to consider how what type of tools we can do to protect those areas. We are looking for some direction from Council today on a potential protected watershed zoning approach, but also a potential conservation zone for lands that are already protected by different levels of government and conservation groups that would limit uses to only low impact or conservation related activities. And that would apply to both public and certain private lands that already has some level of protection on them from different levels of government. And where Council will determine which approaches to move forward that will be applied into draft 2. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about drinking water, which I think we can all agree is one of the most important topics that we can discuss in our municipality within the last few months, that many residents of ours, their wells were dried, and some of them are coming here to refill some jugs with water so they can sustain themselves. So water, a safe, reliable access to drinking water is essential for all Nova Scotians, and that's how the Statement of Provincial of Interest starts. What type of protections they would want to see municipalities within land use regulations apply to watersheds within their areas. We are fortunate to have 3 watersheds in our municipality that are some parts of those watersheds are protected areas. One of them is Heb-Melipsigit and Minimkik Lakes, which provides water for the town of Bridgewater and some communities in MODL, specifically Osprey and especially Osprey Village. We also have Dares Lake, and that provides water for the town of Lunenburg, and Oakland Lake provides water to Mahone Bay. Those areas are, as I mentioned, are protected water areas, and the province regulates activities within that through water source commissions. So the towns have those water source commissions, and they oversee the regulations of activities, so boating, swimming, grazing, forestry, etc. Whereas our responsibility as a municipality is to regulate the land uses that which are stated as what we need to do under the Environment Act. As we all know, drinking water is a statement of provincial interest. So some of the requirements under the Statement of Provincial Interest is to limit high-risk land uses, balance the creation of density and lot creation to protect the water quality, establish setbacks and erosion controls, and apply stronger protection for smaller, more vulnerable watersheds. So, for example, Heb-Melipsigit and Minimkik Lakes is a larger watershed, is a larger protected water area in comparison to Dares Lake or Oakland Lake. Oakland Lake and Dares Lake are significantly smaller watersheds in comparison to the one above. Protecting those natural watersheds is vital for protecting the water quality, and according to the Statement of Provincial Interest Guidebook, planning documents must also identify the natural drainage area, so the actual natural watershed boundary. The issue is that with today's technology, we are aware that what is considered under the Environment Act as protected water areas that actually do not actually map the entire natural watershed boundary. So the protected water areas do not protect the actual natural watershed boundary. It only protects a segment of it. And the reasoning for that is that The mapping for protecting those watersheds was done around the 1970s. It was done through ground truthing, and they did not have the technology that we have today. With the technology that we have today, which we can do desktop analysis and use different other technologies, we know that that for Dares Lake and Heb-Melipsiget and Minimkik lakes, the actual natural watershed boundary is significantly larger than what is currently protected under the Environment Act. More than that, when we did the public engagement, we heard from the public that drinking water is something that they want us to protect. They put a lot of emphasis on protecting these areas through zoning, through other approaches. It's also discussed in the What We Heard report. People are aware of the issues and challenges that we are facing right now with drinking water, and as I mentioned in the beginning of starting talking about drinking water, we are facing drought. Maybe just now, people are starting to have waters in their wells into a certain level that they can actually use it, because they have to wait until you have enough water to actually use it, to use those wells. And a lot of people are coming here today and throughout the summertime to take water in order to sustain themselves. So that's something that's the feedback that we heard from people and stakeholders about the importance of protecting those drinking water sources. So today we will discuss certain approaches of what council can consider for staff to implement into draft 2. Next slide, please. So we have 3 options. The first option is to have 2 watershed zones with no overlay. So that will only protect areas that are not the natural watershed boundary. They will only protect existing protected water areas. And those 2 zones will apply, so there will be a protected water area 1, which will be a more stringent zone that will apply to the smaller lakes and to publicly owned lands within some areas. And that zone will only allow for water utility uses and low impact recreational uses like trails, for example. And then there can be an intermediate zone that will regulate land uses and will make sure and will only enable low density residential uses to happen there with larger setbacks, water course setbacks that council already approved. So there will be around a 75-meter setback, and that's a best practice. So if you look at how contamination goes between, how we can filter contamination that comes with runoff into a water body, 75 meter is a best practice because it helps to eliminate almost 100% of contaminants like nitrogen and phosphorus from entering into the body. And that's the best practice approach to use as a setback, as a 75-meter setback to usually used within the watershed area. It is consistent with the statement of provincial interest. So we're providing restricting harmful land uses within watershed area, but at the same time enabling uses with intermediate zoning approach to larger lakes that can handle more development in comparison to the smaller lakes. Option 2 is to apply the 2 zones as I just mentioned, but also add in a watershed overlay. So also protecting the natural watershed boundary. That approach will add additional requirements like livestock fencing setbacks, runoff controls, and additional watercourse setbacks that might be larger than the 20-meter setback that council already agreed on. So around 30-meter setback is a best practice approach. That, as I mentioned, it will extend the protection beyond the existing protected water areas boundaries, as it will also apply to the natural watershed boundary. That's an approach that council can go with and provide the most robust protection for watersheds, meaning that council is looking at options of, in the future, if there will be an oil spill outside of the protected water areas, but because you already applied those larger setbacks, you're protecting the water that comes, so the contamination that will get into the water body will not necessarily infiltrate into where those lakes are. So those setbacks helps with the filtration process. Option 3 is to go with what a lot of municipalities go to, and it's a more stringent approach, is to have a one watershed zone. But most municipalities use that because they might have just one watershed, and they're also using that one watershed. So for example, Queens region, they have a single uniform zone for their protected water area, and it only allows for water treatment uses to be permitted as of right. Nothing can happen there except from that. It's simple and consistent, but it's less flexible for different watershed sizes and condition, which we have. We do have larger and smaller size watersheds. So these are the options that council can consider. And if you need more clarifications, because it is a complicated topic, I'm here to answer.
We'll start with questions. Councillor Bell.
Thank you. One of the things that we see in the news from time to time, which I know is permits issued by the province, but generally in places like HRM becomes a loggerhead, and that's the licensing of new quarries. Does option 2 or option 3 or both require a much more rigorous interview process before licenses are granted by the province, or can they just do what they want?
That's a great question. I will start first with saying that anything that has to do with natural resources, municipalities we do not have jurisdiction on. So if the province is permitting a quarry to happen within even those protected water areas, they can do so. However, if those protected water areas prohibit those types of activities within those described acts, then quarries cannot happen there. But that's something that has to go through the Service Water Commission. So Service Water Commissions can request the province to amend the Environment Act and prohibit mining activities within those areas. There are some of those protected water areas do have some type of language regarding mining and quarries that technically they are prohibited. However, if the minister provides an approval, there's an approval happening. But that's something that unfortunately as a municipality, we do not have the jurisdiction.
Follow-up, please. So we have a member sitting on Bridgewater Source Water Committee. It seems to me option 2 is what they favor because they continually buy up tracts of land as it becomes available to protect their water supply. Would it seem obvious to everyone that at least option 2 should be a minimum of our thought to align ourselves with one of our closest neighbors?
All other water source commissions favor option 2.
Councillor Wakel.
Thank you. So the watershed areas are mostly within my district, and I am considering option 2 for lots of different reasons, and not just the watershed area just doesn't supply the town of Bridgewater. It also supplies all the people that live within that area for their dug wells. But my concern is the requirements, because there's a lot also in the Waterloo area and the Laconia area, which the natural watershed goes up into, have farms. It's farming country, right? And so I'm just wondering what particular requirements will be imposed upon them, because obviously as of right is one thing, but when you're trying to protect water, are we going to have to impose things upon them that aren't already there, that they have to do.
So the overlay applies to a zone. So whatever zone is there, let's say it's rural general and everything is permitted, let's say most uses are permitted as of right. So let's say you have some agricultural uses located there. The overlay will almost, it depends on how we will go with it, but let's say new agricultural uses, if there will be the overlay, so we would request that the animals, which are actually already are required by different provincial acts, to be fenced in, whether if it's for wandering animals or other things that has nothing to do with water course protection, but already asks animals to be fenced in. The one thing that the overlay, the difference between it and the already water course setback that council already agreed upon is that instead of it being 20 meter, it would be a 30 meter setback. So those would be the additional regulations that would be required within the natural watershed boundary. There aren't any other requirements except from these two setbacks. So a 100-meter setback fenced in for livestock, and a 30-meter watercourse setback. But if there's already a farm there, it's grandfathered in, right? So those regulations do not apply.
Just, and we'll go to Councillor Smith, but just to, and we don't have a picture of it, but just on the watershed area in Councillor Oikel's area, and I'm not sure whether it goes into Councillor Hubley's area or not, if it goes up that far, but it extends, it's a much bigger area than was originally protected. Under the protected area, there we have the picture. So this encompasses a very big area, which I think extends maybe as far north as Baker Settlement. Am I correct? We haven't got the communities identified there, but we'd have to have a look at this. But it is, I see Councillor Hubley's shaking her head, so it slightly into her territory as well. So it does have a much bigger area that many people would not think about in terms of the impact of the water flow and its connection to the water source and the more protected area. So I think there's a big education piece there.
Exactly. Yep.
That many of our residents wouldn't be aware of. We'll go to Councillor Smith next.
I wondered if you could just speak to a point you'd made earlier about the science. You know, the overlay kind of reflects the science as we understand it now, and better reflects what the province intended in the acts. I'm just thinking about, one of the things I'm thinking about is liability. Like, say something were to happen and drinking water was contaminated, and we knew that this is the watershed, but we hadn't protected it. Are we responsible because the zone doesn't reflect what the act requires?
I'm not a lawyer, although my mom actually wants me to be. She keeps on nagging me on that one, but I keep on persisting of being a municipal planner. Unfortunately, I don't have that answer to that, but I see Councillor Burns nodding, so maybe he can answer that better than I can.
Most of my nods were supporting your career choice. I think it's great.
And just as a follow-up, maybe, to take the language back just a little bit, liable, in a legal sense, maybe not, but responsible. Like, are we responsible to follow the science here? And that's why I would be leaning towards option 2. I think it is, it's not in front of me, but I'd be leaning towards option 2 just because it reflects the science and what the province has mandated and you know, our best understanding of what the watershed is. And my feeling is that there's not going to be a lot of requirements that exceed requirements from agricultural environmental plans, which I think was part of the discussion in when we took a really great look at this. This is a great look too, but when we took a more in-depth look earlier. So I feel like it is scary a bit to look at the map, but then like when the details come into place, I'm like, I feel like it's a responsible thing to do, and it's not perhaps that onerous.
And I just want to add to that, that municipalities today are, when they're revising their plans, they are looking at adding that. So for example, Yarmouth is also regulating the natural watershed boundary. It is something, because the science is here, we can use it. In the 1970s, it wasn't. And that's the right. That's the boundaries that we have because of those of the great ground truthing that was done in the 1970s. But with today's technology, we know that it's wider than what they thought it was.
Deputy Mayor Vino.
Thank you. Do you have a map as well of Dares Lake by any chance, or Oakland? If not, it's okay. It won't change my question. During the consultation process, everybody that I spoke to was in favor of protecting watershed areas. It was one of the topics that it was black and white, either you do or you don't. Does the municipality have any onus on if land goes for sale in these areas that we buy it, or is that a provincially regulated assumption?
Usually the water source commissions, so the towns, because they usually are they are the primary users of the watersheds, the lakes. They are in the act, it says that it's recommended for those towns or those water source commissions to purchase lands located within those, surrounding those lakes, to make sure that there is no uses that can harm those watersheds if land use doesn't exist. But if land use does exist, it helps to mitigate even further contaminants entering into the body, because it turns into be a just water utility only use.
And do we have maps for both Oakland and Dares Lake that shows the overlay, like the drainage that might flow into that?
We do, not on
Not
the
here.
presentation,
Okay.
but we can provide you with those maps, and then we can also share them to the public as well. And I agree that I very much agree with the mayor that educational material is very important to make sure that our residents are aware of the size and the importance of protecting these areas.
Thank you.
If I can just clarify, the Oakland one that you see in the map here already reflects the natural boundary. So what you're seeing there matches up well. There's no need to expand beyond that. That's, I think, an easier one to deal with. It's the other two watersheds that we're dealing with a mismatch.
And just for my information, on both the Bridgewater Public Service Commission regulates the one watershed, but are the other two regulated by public service commissions as well?
Indeed. So the Oakland has a water source commission that is down with Mahone Bay, because Mahone Bay is using those waters. And Town of Lunenburg has also a service commission, so a watershed committee that oversees activities on Dares Lake. So there's public service commissions for each one. There's a new one for the Town of Lunenburg.
Yeah.
Deputy Mayor Vino.
Yeah, for the Town of Lunenburg one, the Lunenburg Source Water Protection, it was very inactive during my first council term, but we actually just met last week for the first time and are setting up regular meetings going forward. And I think that is coming off of the summer that we just had, and we'll begin those meetings on a regular basis to make sure that we stay ahead of anything that might be coming up.
Okay. think to Councillor Bell's point earlier, the Bridgewater Public Service Commission has bought considerable amount of land as it has become available and has an advisory committee that looks at identifying specific properties in their protected watershed area so that they're aware of any potential risks and trying to stay ahead of what might be changing in the community. So they are very active, I think, in terms of that monitoring. Councillor Moore.
Am I correct what I'm reading? I'm reading what's on the screen, but I'm also reading what came up to us in the agenda. And it says, staff recommend the council move forward with the two-zone watershed protection approach, option 1.
Staff recommended that because they thought that would be what council would be comfortable with. However, from a science base and what staff would deems to be the actual favorable recommendation from staff, it will be option 2.
Okay, are there other questions on this? Because I think we've kind of clarified enough to have a straw vote here. Those in favor of option 1? Okay, 2, and those in favor of option 2? So we have 2, 4, 6. Okay, and option 3? None. Okay, let's move on then.
I still don't see my 1.5.
So as we mentioned, there's a lot of sensitive areas, wetlands, forests, shorelines, and that play an important role in our biodiversity, but also in the overall environmental health, but also for our quality of life. The conservation zone is a potential tool that a lot of municipalities are using throughout the province and throughout the country as well. To protect areas by limiting development to low-impact uses like passive recreation, research, and education. The zone would mainly apply to publicly owned conservation lands and lands that are owned by environmental organization groups. There are some privately owned lands but they are already subjected to environmental protection, such as the Beaches Act. So, for example, Cherry Hill. Conservation efforts can be supported through mapping sensitive features, protecting those natural vegetations, and using tools like conservation easements, which are usually voluntary. So there's 2 options that council can consider. One is not establishing a conservation zone, which is minimum planning requirement. The conservation goals addressed through the existing tools like setbacks, mapping, and education will not exist. Option 2 is to establish a conservation zone that a lot of municipalities are doing. And we looked at, when we tried to design that zone, we looked at Queens County, region of Queens for how they applied that zone. And we did pretty much the same thing. We applied it to areas that already have provincial or federal regulations or protection of these areas. So, for example, the Beaches Acts, the Wilderness Acts, etc. And also applied that to lands that are already protected by conservation groups, so Kingsburg Coastal Conservancy, etc. And we also looked at how to apply those. So we did that, and when we did the analysis, we saw that if it applies to public and private lands that already has those environmental protections, then approximately it would be outside of the secondary planning areas. It will be around 96 properties. 72 will be public parcels, which also include the conservation groups' lands. And there will be 22 private parcels that already has 8 civic addresses, so already have 8, let's say, houses or sheds or something like that. There's already some type of a structure there. It is important to note, though, that in these 22 private parcels, there's already regulations applied to it And that's why we are proposing for it to be encompassed within the conservation zone, because there's already regulations that apply to those areas. So that's the two options that staff provide for council to consider. Staff is recommending to establishing a conservation zone, as it is important to protect sensitive ecological areas. And from a municipal side of things, if we do add that additional protection, if tomorrow, for example, the minister decides to grant some type of development in an area that's supposed to be protected, our land uses will help to prohibit that development. So that's where our additional layer of protection comes into play. And that's why we're recommending option 2. It is something that a lot of municipalities that surround us are doing, and throughout the province, and also national-wide.
Okay, questions on this? Councillor Smith.
I'm a little bit, the last point, I understand. And I think that is, well applied. But I also don't quite understand how, like when a piece of land enters into an easement, then there's a process where uses are permitted or not permitted. That goes into the agreement, right? So how would that? I just don't understand how us putting a zone in interacts with that, because it would be different for each piece of conserved land, depending on whether it, depending on the agreement that was made up. So, yeah, maybe you could explain that.
I can expand it, but then maybe Reid can expand on that as well. So theoretically, let's say we have a piece of land that is protected by the province through whatever act that it is. And let's say through the act, it says no development should happen there because there is sensitive ecological system there. But then there's also a clause that almost exists in every piece of regulation that the province has, which is upon ministerial approval, there might be an approval to do a development of some sort. So even though right now, let's say under the Beaches Act, a beach is protected, and there are some private parcels encompassed within that area. If tomorrow some developer wants to build a house there, and it meets the coastal protection regulation, let's just say that, okay? And technically, under the act, it's prohibited, but then the minister gives them an approval to build, then it might be that that sensitive ecological system will be destroyed because suddenly that protection is gone from that specific parcel. So applying that conservation zone on it from a municipal land use side of things, if we say we're prohibiting any development except from, let's say, educational piece, low impact recreation, so trails, so you can still enjoy that environment. Even though the minister said yes, we can say, no, our land use says no, you cannot build a house there because our zoning says you cannot. That's where you're almost adding an additional layer into an existing legislation.
All I would add, I think, to that is that the vast majority of these parcels, as it notes, 72 public, are protected by other levels of government or owned by other levels of government. If those other levels of government wanted to do something, they would not necessarily be subject to our municipal bylaws as well. So we can have all the protections we want. The federal government wants to build a new airport or something on, a wilderness area that they own. They could do that, and they could do that without any permission from us. But it does also help to recognize these lands. So the MJA does say that all lands need to be subject to zoning, including government-owned lands. So what it does do, though, is help to identify where those other levels of government have placed a special protection or something like that on those other lands, so that it's much more clear, to the public when they see this is how the land use works here. They see there are these, wilderness areas and these other land trusts and things like that. Those are more clearly identified through zoning to say that's a conservation zone. It really, I think, comes down probably to just the Beaches Act, where there is that little bit of conflict, I think, between some of the experiences that we've seen occur and where those other levels of government have applied some of those designations on private land. So most of the time they're applying these different protections on their own land. The Beaches Act is one of those instances where they've also applied it to privately owned lands, but then the level of protection that's been applied seems to be a bit unknown and what they're willing to allow for development. This would have, in that particular case, as Elle has noted, an additional layer of protection that I think we've seen doesn't exist at the provincial level.
Councillor Oikel.
Just a clarification, the 22 private parcels and 8 with civic addresses, does that mean of the 22, only 8 have homes on them? Is that what that means?
Correct. So it can be homes or any other structure that required issuing a civic address.
Councillor Moore.
So those 22 private parcels, they will be, if this goes through, they will be then notified that this is what's going on?
If council would like us to do that, we can do that, but that needs to be a motion that's
But
done.
so far, they do not know that they're in this mix.
So far, they know that they already are.
Okay.
They have some regulations apply to them, whether
Right.
if it's on a provincial or federal level, there's already regulations
there.
that apply to them, specifically the Beaches Act, which is mostly in Cherry Hill for us, because we're not applying this to the secondary planning areas. And for Cherry Hill, there's a very stringent regulations already applied by the province because of the piping plovers. So they already know that they are within an area that is regulated, not from a municipality standpoint, but from a provincial lens.
Thank you.
Other questions on the, Councillor Burns?
It's kind of a question, and it's kind of just my thoughts to the rest of the councillors is, in principle, I actually see where the zone makes a lot of sense, and on public parcels, I actually have no issue with slapping this on there, because we're doing it on parcels that largely are already in the public domain. I think to get comfortable in the 22 private parcels, I'd have to dive into that more. Like, I'm not going to find my comfort level with that in this session. I'd have to actually look at the parcels and better understand, but that goes back to my lawyer brain. Don't get a lawyer brain, stay on the planner brain. I think for me, like, to steal Kathy's language about the 1.5, it's not that I don't want a conservation zone provided for in the document. It's that when it comes to the public lands, I'd be comfortable in slapping it on. And if there are people who would like this zoning placed over private lands, I'm more in favor of people coming to us and saying, I'd like to include this. And as we move forward as a municipality, having people come forward and say, we like this, whether it's individually or as a community or whatever, to have zoning applied to things, that's where I find much more of my comfort level. So I know that's not really an option that's presented here, but I'd float it as just another little bit of confusion out there for folks that like it. Again, happy for the public, happy for it to be included in the document. I'm just not ready to slap it on the private lands yet.
I would suggest that communities usually come forward when there's been a problem. And then it's often we're not able to do something because the problem exists. So this is, with all respect, Councillor Burns, this is about moving that half to a decision that really reflects leadership on our part in recognizing that some of these areas are, well, they've been identified as having some feature to them that needs protection in some way, that will benefit from having that protection. And I think waiting for the public to come forward, it's usually too late when we're in that situation. So, other questions? Councillor Oikel.
I just want to confirm what you said, that those 22 private parcels are already underneath an act. They already have restrictions on them already.
Correct.
And so by establishing a conservation zone, we're just letting the public know more, and their neighbors know more, that these areas are protected.
So as Reed mentioned, it will help identify those areas because they will be on the map as, let's say, as a conservation zone. But more than that, it will provide that additional protection to, as the mayor mentioned, that there wouldn't be a chance when the community comes because there's an issue, but council can't do anything about it because it's already been done. So this is almost like taking a proactive approach and applying that additional protection on an area that is already protected, but could be that in the future will not. So the land use, the conservation zone will add that additional layer of protection to ensure that communities will not have to come to council with an environmental concern in these areas.
If I could just add to speak to that, with the case of the Beaches Act in particular, I think largely been understood by the public as a level of protection the province has placed in certain areas. I think in some circumstances, what it typically dictates is that no development can occur in those areas. So with this, it's just putting the conservation zone over where it says this is already protected. However, we are also aware of situations where people have applied to the minister for an exemption to build something where they were granted that exemption. And so in those circumstances, this then provides a protection that whether the minister gives that exemption or not, they'd also have to come here and apply for a rezoning. And then it gives the municipality some control over that as well. And I think it's partly to reflect that people have an understanding that there's already that protection there, but we've seen how it isn't quite as tight, I think, as a lot of people thought it was. So this would help in those situations where apparently there's a separate process that people can go to the province and ask to do a development in an area that says it's protected already.
Deputy Mayor Vino, and then we'll take our straw vote.
I forgot my original question because a new one popped up when you spoke there. So if I own a piece of one of these private parcels that is currently protected, but then I decide I want to develop and I get permission from the province, option 2 is going to add another layer to me to go through to change what I want to do with that land.
Yeah, in that situation, yes, because the intention is that it's an already protected area. So whether it's most likely the Beaches Act is the situation we're talking about. And I think what the public's understanding is the Beaches Act has protected those areas from development. And in those situations where people apparently are getting exemptions, yes, it adds another layer where they then need to come to this municipality and explain why they think that the development's appropriate for this situation. The process that the province uses, from our understanding, is not, there's not a big analysis of whether that's the right thing to do. They don't have that set up. There's no formal, there's not a public process. There's not a look at the environmental impacts. There's not a whole process set up there. It's a bit of an anomaly. What this would do would be to formalize that here, to say, well, if this situation occurred here, there's always that option for somebody to come and zone it something else, but they would need to have a public process and public input. Council would get to make the final decision about whether that's appropriate and consider all those things in a more of a public forum. Okay.
And just supplementary to that, can you give me a couple examples that are not related to the Beaches Act of public and private?
We're not aware of anything other than that. So
Okay.
basically, I think the 22 here, and I don't know this with 100% confidence, are I think all under the Beaches Act, because the provincial legislation and federal, where they're protecting lands, it's all their own lands. Yeah, so I think it's really, we're only just talking about Beaches Act situation, yep.
Okay, Councillor Smith, you slide in under the...
Yeah, just sorry, one last little quick question. Conservation easements, though, would be part of this as well. And some of that would be on privately owned land.
Yes, so in the public parcels, as Ella mentioned, that captures those lands as well. So Nature Trust, and some of the smaller organizations, like the LaHave Islands, I know that was just a recent one, I think is the best, and I believe that was the Nova Scotia Nature Trust, that would be under this public parcels category that's here. And in terms of the land uses, and you're correct in that those agreements are all specific to what people can do. And largely, we have an understanding of those types of activities. All of that would be permitted within a conservation zone. It's broad for those types of activities, and then those individual agreements get into real specifics about certain areas that are off limits and certain areas that are okay for trails and things like that. But it wouldn't have a conflict with having different agreements in place and different things at that level.
Okay, let's vote. Option 1, 3, and option 2, 2, 4, 6. Okay.
So now we'll transition into discussing how future use zones could fit into a municipal planning framework. And I'll flag that this is essentially the last section of this presentation, so we're nearing the end. And as Reid mentioned, future use zones can act as a tool to reserve or designate areas of land for a specific type of use, and often those that are more likely to cause land use conflict with others. For example, a group of heavy industrial uses, or growth-oriented development, for example, that you would want to limit development on until the time it could be comprehensively developed. And in draft 1, these zones were not applied to parcels of land on the zoning map. In other words, in order to be applied or utilized, land would have to be rezoned to one of the future use zones. So draft 1 proposed 6 different future use zones. In order of those listed on the screen, draft 1 proposed a general commercial zone, a comprehensive development district zone, a commercial recreation zone, fisheries and marine zone, a heavy industrial zone, and a light industrial zone. However, we heard through public feedback that residents wanted a simplified approach to zoning, one that more closely reflects minimum planning and doesn't overcomplicate the planning framework. And as a result, we're going to present 3 options to regulate these types of uses. And 2 of the options we'll discuss do not require the creation of additional zones, so we can move into those now. And I can answer specific questions as well about those individual future use zones when we get into the question portion. So 3 options. Council could direct staff to option 1, not establish any future use zones, and regulate specific industrial or large-scale commercial uses by site plan approval in a general rural zone. So within this option, certain industrial and large-scale commercial uses could be permitted by site plan approval, which would be providing a development officer with some control over aspects like lighting, signage, egress, parking, etc. And this would represent a minimum planning approach. The second option, which is the recommended option, is to not establish any future use zones, but to regulate specific industrial or large-scale commercial uses by site plan approval and development agreement in the general rural zone. So this would allow for more control through the development agreement level of control for specific uses, perhaps heavy industrial use that council might want more oversight over. And then the third option is what was originally proposed in draft 1, and that was to establish the comprehensive suite of future zones, like those described in the overview of the previous section. And we are not recommending this, even though it was proposed in draft 1, because based on the public feedback we heard, it seemed to complicate the document too much, and residents wanted a more simplified approach that had minimal zones, but was not a one-size-fits-all approach. So those are the 3 options, and happy to answer questions.
Deputy Mayor Vino.
What raises a flag for me is the word some. What constitutes some? Some industrial, some commercial. That's where I'm at right now with that word.
I think that's definitely a level of detail we would need to get into as we go into the drafting stage of draft 2. We didn't have enough time just with the timeline to kind of parse out what those specific, the difference between the level of control that we would apply, but that would be part of the analysis we do as we move to draft 2.
I can add just a bit of an example. So one of the types of, so in draft 1, we had these different zones created, and we created different thresholds where you could do a certain scale of development within a zone. But if you wanted to go above that, that kicked you into, say, a heavy industrial zone or a light industrial zone or something like that. So we would take a similar approach to how we already established things like thresholds, but do that within the existing zones like the rural zone. So as an example, one of those types of uses that is the most, conflict ridden would be a salvage yard. So, if that would be a type of use where I think we would say, that's a type of use that should only ever be permitted by a development agreement. That's not the type of thing that you want to see as of right in a whole bunch of areas. You want to make sure that you've got more control over that as opposed to other things. In draft 1, that was a type of use that was permitted only in the heavy industrial area. So in this is a situation where we would take that zone from the heavy industrial zone and say, oh, it's going to be permitted in the rural area, but only by development agreement. And then you've got the highest level of control, but you're still permitting it within that rural zone. Just as an example.
So just to that, would you then to the point that Councillor or Deputy Mayor Vino has raised, would you then list things that would be considered, like actual business types?
Yeah, so that's correct. In that rural zone, we would have a longer list of permitted uses than there is in draft 1, because some of those uses were only listed in those industrial or marine and fisheries types of zones. Those will now get all included in the rural zone, but some of them would be as of right, some of them would be by site plan approval, some would be by development agreement. So typically using that kind of tiered approach, depending on the scale of the development.
Councillor Smith.
I can't remember if in draft 1 we had the definitions section included, what is a site plan approval, what is a development agreement. I find, just to put in a little request for draft 2, it would be nice to have that laid out quite clearly so that when people are reading, maybe even, a little section that compares what the levels of regulation do, because, at times I've felt I'm not quite sure what each level demands, but I think there's a big difference, and being able to understand and communicate that is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. A lot of that explanation lives in the municipal planning strategy. So there's a whole bunch of different policies that basically outline, when you're reviewing a development agreement, here's the criteria, here's what gets considered, here's all of the policies. So when we're getting an application, typically the document we're looking at to evaluate is actually the planning strategy document. And it does outline kind of what that is, how it works, what are all the things that get considered. And so when we do like a planning report, sometimes what you'll see is a table or a comparison and say, does it meet all of this criteria? That criteria is coming out of the municipal planning strategy. Having said all of that, neither of those documents, I would say, are the most publicly accessible. We're really attempting to do that as much as we can with both documents. But I think more importantly, when this stuff gets rolled out, there needs to be a lot of communication to the public about all of the different processes. Those are some of those things that we can develop some material that in plain language on a page or two talks about these new processes and how they work. And it would be better that they live in that type of document rather than inside the land use bylaw or something.
Deputy Mayor Vino, did you have a further question? Looked like you had something on your mind.
I don't think so. I'm just taking it all in, but a further thought while I have the mic to what Councillor Smith was saying in the draft, when we refer to development permits and site plans, even having refer to page whatever, so they can flip to it and read what it is instead of coming back might be helpful in that draft too.
Councillor Reinhardt.
Could you explain the difference between applying for a development agreement versus applying to have an area rezoned? Like if you were wanting to start some kind of heavy industrial?
The evaluation process is very similar. The development, I should say the zoning amendment process is looking at a use and determining whether that use is appropriate or whether that zone is appropriate for that property or parcel or not. And council has the ability to say, no, it's not appropriate for that parcel. It is subject to an appeal, but if you have the proper policies in place that say, look, that type of zone, you know, that heavy industrial property, or say, as an example, this residential subdivision lot should not be a heavy industrial zone. That's a pretty easy one to consider and say, no, that's not appropriate. Doing something by development agreement is not to say no outright. So in this situation, you would be permitted, but by development agreement only. And then there's a public process and council can evaluate through a pretty comprehensive criteria, the same criteria that you would use to evaluate a development through a rezoning. But the difference there is that one is permitted by development agreement, the other one is not permitted in that zone and needs to be rezoned. So the zone itself change, that does give you a little bit more protection, if you more, or and if on the other side of things, it's more prohibitive or more complex to overcome because the development agreement process says it is permitted. Whereas if it's a zoning change, it's not permitted and you have to change the zone. So that's the biggest difference between them.
Okay. Other questions on this? Feel like the energy's dissipating here. We're getting to the end. Not really.
No. We're getting to the beginning.
We're getting to the end of this chapter in the municipal planning book. You ready to have a straw vote? So option one, those in favor of option one. So we've got 2, 4, 5. And those in favor of option 2. 2, 3, 4. Pretty well split. That gives you really a lot of help.
Yeah.
Well, you got rid of option 3, though.
We did that. We did that. Yeah.
So you did the 1.5.
Yeah, the 1.5. Just a point that was, I should just ask, is there further things that you want to raise with us?
That's the last of this.
Okay.
All I would mention is that next week we will have a few more topics. These are smaller and more limited in scope. I don't anticipate there to be as much discussion.
Okay. Just because it's come up a couple of times today, and I think that we should think about this a bit as we go forward, is how this gets presented to the public and the materials that are needed to support a good communication with them. Because I think one of the things we learned from our first experience was that document was very difficult for people to use and understand, and the understanding of the municipal planning strategy and then the accompanying bylaws that support it, people were very confused by that. So I don't have a good answer or a good recommendation, but I think it's been raised by several people today, and I think our experience tells us that we really need to think through how we put together documents that are going to be really helpful to people when we go back out with draft 2. So I think our communication people can be very helpful. I know that Sarah's leaving, but hopefully you can pick her brain before she goes out the door, or whoever the new person is, hopefully will be in place before we're drafting those documents. But I think it will go a long way in helping to communicate this effectively with people, and also in their ease of use of the documents, in when they start to review things, that we make it as comprehensive as possible, but also as accessible as possible. I don't have any great direction to offer you, but.
I can just speak a little bit on that. Our work plan at this point is we'll have discussion next week. And in January is when we will be making all of these edits and revisions and doing the drafting. And we just had a small discussion here on the break. I think it would be appropriate for us to bring forward an engagement plan, probably at the end of January, once we have a good picture of the change and the scale of change and things like that are happening. And we'll be able to, I think, gauge a little bit how much interest there may be, especially around maybe what people saw before and what they're going to see now. But we'll want to particularly know council's view on how and where and when and those types of things. And then we can outline the amount of work that might involve. Like if we need to prepare a lot of additional explanatory materials, that's going to take more time. But if that's what we need to do, we can do it, and we'll just revise what our timeline looks like so that we're meeting whatever council wants. But I think January would be when we could come forward and have that discussion.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. It gives you time to kind of parcel out what you've heard from us and how you put it in the context of what was heard before. I think we have to stick to the deadline that we are trying to work towards. I think we have to be very diligent in doing that for a number of reasons. One, that we're meeting commitments to the province, but we also as a council have a lot of other work we want to do, and you do too. So I think we want to be able to close the chapter on this part of it by mid 2026, which is I'm going to just say mid 2026, and we're going to work towards that as the goal, because for all kinds of reasons. So this will come back, but we'll meet again next week. Is there any closing comments anyone wants to make around this? That's all the agenda items we have for this meeting, so I'll declare this meeting adjourned.